All right. Janet and Daniel, can you jump on video?
Hello there.
So I guess my first question is that a Zoom background or are those your bookshelves, Janet?
They're real books and gives us research right behind me.
That's great. And is that a home office?
It is.
Daniel, how long have you been working hybrid? Hybrid's new for everybody. I'm curious, how long have you been working some form of hybrid?
About 8 years.
So I am extremely excited to have two folks who are experts both in their own experience of hybrid and also in implementing policy and methodologies for organizations in the workplace. Janet and Daniel, really quick, Janet, who are you? Where do you work? What do you do? And then we'll jump to Daniel.
Sure. I'm Janet Poe McLaurin. I'm a principal with almost 4 decades at Gensler. And as an architect and workplace strategist, I co-lead our workplace practice areas globally. But my primary role is the global workplace research leader, which is one of the 6 centers of the Gensler Research Institute.
Daniel?
And my name is Daniel Hampshire, and I am a senior manager of workplace technology at LinkedIn. I've been at LinkedIn for about 10 years, bouncing around between internal IT and now in workplace designing and building our workplaces. And I live in Sydney, Australia.
I think it might be a little bit hard to hear you, Daniel. We just got a note, so if you don't mind getting a little bit closer to the mic.
Sorry, how's this?
That's really, really good. So Daniel also has a spectacular NPR voice, better than mine. All right, so I think I'd like to kind of start with, for Gensler and LinkedIn, are you back in office yet? Have you reopened? Have you always been open? What is the current state of Gensler?
Well, we're just now starting to go back to the office. We're doing it in phases. Most of our offices have now been in some phase of reopening, depending on local conditions. And I'm based in Washington, D.C. And so, yes, we're starting to go back into the office and get our feet wet. I'm still sitting at home because I work across the globe, but I plan on going in pretty soon.
Daniel, you are LinkedIn operates a global portfolio. Do you have regional offices that are back? What's the current state of things?
Yeah, we've just started opening up our Bay Area and some of our North America offices throughout APAC. They've been open for longer, and we're still in a reactive mode with the pandemic. And so like our Australia offices just closed again after being open for a couple of months.
I'm curious. A lot of organizations pre-pandemic had talked about unassigned seating, more flexible work, working from home, remote policies, recruiting from anywhere. The pandemic seems to have forced a lot of these conversations to the forefront, where we can do things that perhaps were harder culturally in the past. Safety was a really big point of conversation over the last year. I'm curious, particularly with what's going on with the Delta variant, if safety remains the primary thrust behind some of these changes, or if we really are wandering into the utopia of space design and the utopia of, what architecture grad students have always wanted for space. And I'll leave it to either of you to jump in.
I'll jump in. I think safety is still first and foremost on everybody's mind. The more we were learning about the COVID-19 and how it works, it's air filtration and making sure that the space itself is very safe for people. So that's first and foremost. And I know in some of the Gensler offices, we've actually enhanced our air filtration systems and done everything to make sure that people feel safe, healthy, and valued, and that their concerns are really met. And then beyond that, we're starting to really hear that privacy is more important than ever. And being able to really provide private spaces for people to use is first and foremost as we start thinking about the people experience and what people need as they start going back to the office. What are you seeing at LinkedIn, Daniel?
Yeah, pretty similar. We started about a year ago upgrading most of our air filters where we can to MERV 13. We have had discussions about whether there's a benefit to allowing people to manually purge rooms if they feel like the air quality is not as good as they're expecting, and kind of the engineering issues with doing that versus the perception of how good the space or how healthy the space is. We've also had discussions about showing people. So as we're now monitoring air quality or installing sensors to monitor air quality at the occupant level, how much of that information do we want to show? Is that helpful information? Is that actually more scary? If we're showing bad air quality, can we actually respond to that? Can we actually do anything about that?
This is seems to be a pretty material topic from just a cost standpoint. Like, where do you make investments? Where do you consolidate? We've talked to some folks that I've heard have consolidated 50% of a multi-million square foot portfolio. Organizations that have decided not to make any changes at all, and some organizations that are continuing to buy and build real estate. I'm curious, Janet, is getting rid of real estate and consolidating because we're moving to unassigned seating in some places still the right move? Is growing real estate, what are you sort of seeing in the data as Gensler is thinking about coming back to office?
Well, and we've been doing a number of different global surveys all during the pandemic. We've been doing global research for over 15 years and starting to really understand how people are working, space effectiveness, workplace experience, and the like. But we've asked a whole series of different questions during the pandemic. First it was trying to understand how people were working from home, what they missed about the office. Now it's where and how do people want to work in a post-pandemic future? And in our latest survey, we asked about space reduction and space optimization. And the most interesting thing that we saw is top performing companies, those that are on the most admired list of best places to work list, most innovative kind of companies, that they're on those lists is how we defined it. Those are actually expecting to take more space post-pandemic, whereas the ones that are not on that list, kind of unranked firms, are actually looking to shed real estate. And so there's a real different approach and kind of attitude toward what is it that employees need. And these top performing companies, they're really looking at using the office very differently and bringing people together to do different activities than some of the unranked firms are actually considering.
Daniel, you've noticed a difference in the concept of like what is mine as an employee based on region. Can you maybe reiterate that point and where there's differences?
Well, certainly, we have been communicating, talking, discussing with different teams and leadership groups around the world, and trying to introduce ideas like team-based seating or non-one-to-one seating. And I think what's interesting is in North America, where we actually have probably more of capacity issues, where we've continued to hire throughout the pandemic. We've also continued to grow our spaces, but I think hiring is going to be outpacing our ability to acquire and provide space the most in North America. Surprisingly, given those constraints and challenges, those are the places within our company that don't want to come back to, they don't want to try something new. They want what they had. Outside of North America, particularly in APAC, they are dying to try something new. They don't want the
Why is
old
that?
thing.
Why is that?
From my perspective with technology, outside of North America has actually been the most bleeding edge, the most hungry for something new. And I think we see that in like the consumer trends as well. You know, in APAC, you buy the new technology no matter what it is.
Gotcha. So I wanted to remind folks that we work questions in. If you have questions and you just click the Q&A button and you just toss them in, I'll work them into the discussion as we go. We don't have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. We're going to use the full time to just sort of keep the panel going. One other question, and then I'm going to jump back to Janet. One other question for you, Daniel. You said a house is not a home. It's the people that use it and occupy the space. And one, I want to know, what do you mean by that? And two, how can assigned space, I just want to quickly say, I don't know that I have a personal perspective on whether or not assigned or unassigned is better or worse, but just your perspective that assigned space can exacerbate the problem if only a certain number of folks show up to a really large office space. What did you mean by these things, and what does it mean for LinkedIn?
Trying to remember the I think the context was, you know, when we don't have assigned seating, you know, what are the things that actually make your space feel yours? And I think there are aspects of ownership and personalization that make what our offices were fun and exciting. The streamers and weird cardboard cutouts of like Liam Neeson, or, you know, things that people had at their desks, family photos.
I mean, who doesn't miss a cardboard cutout of Liam Neeson?
Yeah. I think those are all things that contributed to the team culture and the company culture. And I think one of the biggest concerns is how do we incorporate unassigned seating without losing that fun? Now, I can't remember why I said a house is not a home. Oh, that's right. So the whole concept for me is like, why do people want to go back to the office? Now, when I gave up my desk 8 years ago. I just said, I don't ever use it. And it's not because I was in meetings all day long. It's just because I preferred to be more social and to move around. And by the function of my job, not everyone was always sitting at their desk. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people. So why come back to the office? I think it's really for the people, it's for the social support, for the relationship building. And so really, when I think about what is going to feel comfortable about the office, well, I think it's going to be both a combination of the services that you're providing. And we think about how our space types shifting, what's more important. I think desking is going to become less and less important, and more of the collaboration spaces, both open and closed spaces, as well as I kind of imagine, like I know what I would like is to be able to go to a barista bar with tons and tons of open seating and just sit there and have people go and order coffee and see me and go, hey, what are you doing here? I haven't seen you in forever. And like have those types of interactions all day long.
It's interesting. It's like being able to choose to be interrupted, or to like put yourself in a circumstance where you can actively be interrupted. Janet, is there anything, you know, there's this question sort of about like hybrid workplace, like what are the tools that now need to be integrated for a more inclusive workplace? Essentially, like what does the space become about? I know that Daniel just touched on it, but can you tell us just sort of like what Gensler is seeing, what you're seeing? You know, what does the office become?
Sure. I think the role of the office is starting to shift a little bit. You know, it was pre-pandemic. People went to do all their work. Now, I think the office is going to shift to what does it need to support that can't be done in other places, whether that's home, whether that's co-working sites, whether that's third places. And in a way, it starts to become a place for the two ends of the spectrum. It's for not only collaboration, because we talk about, okay, we can't wait to get back to the office because we miss our colleagues. We miss that socializing. We miss that impromptu, the coaching, the mentoring, the formal meetings that we had, and which is really about building culture and alignment and being together. But we also miss the office for deep focus. There are a number of people that really need the office to focus. And so if you think about both ends of the spectrum of deep focus and hyper collaboration, that is a different mix of spaces than what we had before. And Daniel, I totally agree with you. It's less about providing a desk for everyone because people are coming in at different tempos and for different purposes. So how do you start to rethink what the mix of the spaces are, and how do you start to be very intentional about what that work experience is really going to be, and think about the workplace as an ecosystem of different spaces, both in the office, outside the office, and home, all being part of that ecosystem.
So there's a really good question about sort of bringing folks back that I'm going to get to from Kevin in a second. But I'm curious, Janet, do you think that offices and companies are competing with the convenience of working from home?
I think you've got to make the office worth the commute. And I'll use myself as an example. I have 3 hours of commuting between where I live in Maryland and to DC.
Oof.
And so do I want to do that every single day like I did before? Probably not, because I find, working from home is very convenient for certain things. But I miss being face to face with people. And for certain things, I'm going to want to go into the office just to be with other people. There's certain brainstorming, ideation, certain things are much easier to do in person and to be with other people. And so I don't think it's a competition. I think it's how can we make it complementary? So there are going to be certain things that may be easier at the office, hosting events and virtual, platforms, whether it's meetings or webinars or the like, and other things are easier to attend from home. And so there's going to be this combination of different things. Whereas somebody I work with that lives very close to the office that can walk over, they may walk over for a set part of the day and then go home. Because I have a long commute, I'm going to go in, extend that day, make the use of that day when I am in the office, and try not to commute as often during the week. So I think there's going to be different ways that we're going to use the space at the office, and different ways that we may use third places as cities start to open up.
So,
and I'll just
go ahead.
I was just going to say I'll use China as an example. So they've been back for a long while, and our Shanghai office, our Beijing offices are open. They're using their cities and these third places as places to work and to meet, as well as home and the office. And so there's different ways that we may start to use kind of this ecosystem.
So Kevin's question, that makes a ton of sense, Janet. Kevin's question, and Daniel, I'm curious your perspective. What in-office technologies are you predicting will encourage employees to come back to the office?
Internet, the main thing, probably. Like good internet,
like
good
fast internet.
Yeah, that's probably the main thing. I mean, even in Australia ranks 63rd in the world in internet speed, which is maybe surprising to some people. I moved here and I didn't realize that I was going to be walking into a country that only had ADSL for a number of years. But I think actually, as we've been bringing people back into the office technologies are actually creating more challenges than it's more challenging than enticing. So our conference rooms.
What do you mean by that?
I think we've gotten used to a certain level of things. Well, one, wearing headphones or having people's voices very clearly and loudly blasted into our ears. And also having a microphone that's pretty close to our mouths. So when we come back and we're doing video conferencing, there's kind of two main challenges that we're figuring out, which is this sound where everyone sounds like they're talking into a big massive like expanse all of a sudden, and then sitting at the end of a large conference room where your head's like this small on your screen. So the hybrid aspect of coming back to the work, it's almost easier to continue doing this in terms of technology than it is to go back to the office. So we need to figure those things out. There's now also features that people have gotten used to with like chat and emojis and emotes, pronouns attached to your name, even just knowing who people are. I mean, like, this is great because if I didn't know who you were, Andrew, I could see your name there, but in a conference room, you're just a bunch of random people again, potentially. So I don't know that the technology in the office is necessarily the draw. I think it brings a lot of challenges to how do we creatively bring people back to the office where we can still do hybrid work as effectively as we do now and level the playing field.
So there are a whole bunch of really good questions that just sort of like streamed in, which I'm going to get to in just a quick second. I'm curious if either of you have been in an office recently where you needed to do a presentation. Okay, Daniel, you're nodding. You said you have. How did it go? Was it seamless? Like, were you able to get the presentation up on the screen? I was so out of practice. Like, we ended up using Zoom, even though we were all in the same room. Curious what happened with you.
I guess as a word of caution, I had to walk around to probably 6 different conference rooms to find one that wasn't broken in some way or another. Our iPads have exploded or the batteries have completely died for room schedulers across the world. And I don't know why people aren't supposed to be in the office, but some things are disconnected. Software updates haven't been pushed. There's a lot of inconsistencies throughout our offices that are requiring a lot of, even though it's not
the same with clients.
Yeah, it hasn't been used.
They're complaining about the same issues.
Nothing's been used, in theory, but it doesn't work like it did when we left.
So what you're saying is, like, we can't neglect these spaces and just like hope that they all work when you come back, that there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that the office works for folks, which maybe leads to a really good question about how you keep equity or sort of inclusivity between employees that are working both in office and remotely. How do you make sure that you're, remote first for meetings? Like, how do you just think about ensuring that you've got facilitating collaboration or contributions from people, even if the dominant group is in remote or dominant group is in person?
I think it's a change of behavior, it's a change of attitude, because we've been working this way for a year and a half now, and Daniel said it's been a level playing field, and it feels very inclusive. Now, when you've got a group sitting in a conference room and everybody else is calling in virtual, it's very uneven. How do you make sure that there may be rules that some clients are starting to think about, and we're starting to look at that within Gensler too. Do you have a mandate or a guideline or even a suggestion of not having too many people in the conference room that dominate the meeting? How do you start thinking about the dynamics? How do you run a meeting differently so that everybody does feel included? You're calling on people that haven't spoken on a while. We just did that naturally when we were all together in person or apart, all dialing in virtually. Now, when you've got part in person and part hybrid, it's going to take some very intentional behaviors to make sure that everybody does feel included.
Yeah, we have thought about this for 18 months, and across the board, the whiteboard seems to be where we're investing, like what seems to be the most wise investment of our time, because other than talking and recording, I mean, there's kind of two main things. Like, the ideas that happen in the office are the main things that we miss, because right now all of our time is scheduled. So the only thing that we're missing is conversations that we haven't scheduled. But in the office, there are unscheduled conversations that are happening where you can't quickly say like, oh, let's make sure Janet's here. Well, Janet might be making lunch or something, not at her desk. And even in person, I mean, there's real practical things in person as well. So how do we capture the ideas and the conversations that are happening? I think there's two shifts. One is we're playing with both digital whiteboards, which are persistent whiteboarding spaces that are online. When you're in the office and you're whiteboarding, you put those ideas there, the entire team can see it, or whoever you're sharing it with can see it. You walk away, that goes. You come back and you put it back where it was.
So such as, can you give folks some names, like what types of software do you like these days?
So I think a great app, like probably the best whiteboarding application is Miro right now. There are others. There's versions like, well, I mean, there's lots of versions, but I think Miro is doing it the best.
I love it. We use it as well.
And so we're really trying to figure out how do we use that application. I mean, employees have those on their laptops, they have it on their iPads, but then you go into the office, you've got your open collaboration spaces, your desks. And in the conference rooms, how do we make that work? And this has been we've talked to all of our peers in the tech industry. No one has figured out digital whiteboarding, and there are no companies that have figured out digital whiteboarding. And you could go to Samsung or to the like 50 different types of touch display manufacturers. And there are issues with doing this with everything, particularly the touchback control, which is the idea that we've chosen to not use an integrated whiteboarding application because we want to use Miro. So that requires somebody to plug in their laptop to a touch display. If they're drawing on it, that has to go back to your laptop and then back to Miro. So we found, in terms of like, here's our secret sauce. There's a couple, but we're working with Avocor, and there's a lot of technical challenges with like drivers across Macs and Windows, but we think it's minimally viable to be useful in the office, which is one person can draw on this digital whiteboard, connect it to their laptop. They can share that across video conferencing or in the room, and I'll have that captured into that application. And then you unplug your laptop, that session's there. You can share it. You can continue working on it offline or with other people and bring it back the next day if you want.
So I want to talk a little bit about talent. How are you thinking about, Janet, you work with a lot of organizations that are sort of have often seen their real estate as a draw for top talent. We now have people that are going to all different parts of the world to do their work because, I'm calling in from New Hampshire, but I live in San Francisco, and it's not really that different, even though Daniel's in Australia. So I'm curious, Janet, do you build offices when there's a concentration of folks in more rural communities or in different communities in secondary and tertiary cities, or downsize headquarters? Like what is real estate strategy now that we have folks in a lot of different places?
And I think it all depends on the people strategy. We've got some clients that are starting to think, okay, it's more of a hub and spoke kind of model, that we're going to have a central office, we're going to have satellite offices depending on how many people may be in that area. You may use co-working space, you may build space, it may just be large conference rooms when you need to bring people together. Or we're going to invest a little bit more on travel. We've got other clients that are starting to think about, okay, if we can really work anywhere, then I don't need to just have a recruiting strategy that is where our offices are. We can start really looking at a distributed workforce. And so there's both ends of those spectrums that are starting to drive how you start thinking about space, how you start bringing people together. And I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all. There's not going to be this magic, solution, but you've got to think it through of what's really right for that organization and how do they really work? Where do they need to be in person? And when do they need to continue to work virtually?
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about, it started pouring rain, so I had to step inside, and I appreciate everybody's patience with my changing background. Teams need space to collaborate. are people going to be coming in, practically speaking, Daniel, if you're on marketing, you show up Tuesdays and Thursdays. Is it people sort of free form, show up when you'd like? Is it we are all in as a company Monday through Thursday? How are you dealing with the policy around teams coming together and making sure that they have the space that they require?
I don't think there's going to ever be one across the board answer. I mean, people are just so diverse in the ways that they work. So I think the policy is likely going to be that, managers and teams decide their own work schedules and norms and things like that. I know that personally, even when I think that I want to go into the office, by the time that day rolls around, I really regretted making that decision. So I think probably like for people who are saying like, I'm going to go in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Monday's going to roll around and they're going to go, I can just do this at home. So there's going to need to be like either managers that kind of dictate, say like, we have to be in Monday, Wednesday, Friday because this product or this project or this thing needs to get done and we all need to be there. That gets people over that hurdle of getting out of bed and being like, do I really got to do this commute? But the natural things that will probably happen like outside of that scheduled time is like, we can't solve it. Like this communication like this is too hard. We have to get in person to overcome this communication barrier that we have sitting at home.
What is the communication barrier? Can you define it?
For me, it's like working with architects and different designers. And it's always like, we're having these 1-hour conversations a week. It's taking forever to solve a problem. We can have like 10 more meetings each week. And it would just be so much easier to hold it, touch it, whiteboard it, talk about it in person, look at it and see it. Those are the kinds of things.
I agree with you, Daniel. When you think about work is very dynamic. There's periods of like thinking through a design, solving a problem. I think it may be short-sighted to think about it's certain days of the week. Your work doesn't necessarily flow to those days of the week. It may be that for a project phase, you really need to be in the office and then you're able to work virtually for the next phase as things start to come together, and then you're together again on certain milestones. So I think it's going to depend on the tempo of the work and starting to think about when do you really need to be together and when can you start to work apart. And if you're on multiple teams, that means that you're going to need to think through that tempo in aggregate. So that you're really starting to be in person when you need to be, but also balancing that personal aspect of, okay, it's time to buck up and make that commute into the office when you need to, but you've got to have some variability for the dynamics of the work and the team, because it's a collective we. It's not an individual decision. You've really got to come at it from what do we need and how do we work best.
Daniel, you're doing a whole bunch of measurement. I'm curious, what are you measuring and what are you going to do with all the data?
Great questions, Andrew. I'll let you know when we figure it out. Well, we're measuring utilization, and there's a number of things. I mean, we started off with wanting to understand capacity, and there's a lot that comes with understanding capacity and like the supply and demand and the utilization, particularly with attendance. I think that's a good starting point, understanding attendance, but I always worry about how attendance can mean so many things. Like low attendance doesn't necessarily mean bad things. Like it could just be a period of time. So I think we're going to need a long period of time of measuring something like attendance before we can start to make decisions like, oh, we need, well, like particularly like we can get rid of this office space confidently. The other things that I'm I'm interested in trying to measure, and this is feature utilization. So we talked about that whiteboard. I want to know, like, did someone use a pen? Did they use their fingers? What area of the display are they using? If we're introducing features like recording and chat, like how often are they using that? And that's hard to measure for us now, and we're going to implement that. But we've also started measuring things like indoor air quality, and then with acoustics, we have a small pilot to measure sound levels within the office because like one of the things we want to try and mitigate is like distractions, but I don't want to just blast white noise into the office because that is in itself distracting. So we're playing around with soundscaping and using microphones to kind of detect what the ambient noise level is, and then raise the threshold of the ambient noise level to a point where I can't hear a conversation that's happening 60 feet away from me, which in some very poorly treated office spaces, you can hear that. Like you can have that sort of thing. So
I have a 9-month, I have a 10-month-old baby girl named Josephine, who sometimes makes surprise appearances on this webinar. And she has a sound machine. And if it's too loud, it is really irritating. And if it's not if it's like just right, it puts her right to sleep. So I totally get the concept on sort of acoustics. There's a number of questions on affecting employee growth and career advancement. How do you, being in person, whether we like it or not, has sort of these impacts on how much trust there is between a manager and an employee. So I'm curious, Janet, how you have, is this part of the conversations that clients of yours are having around how to deal with career development? And I realize, like, maybe this doesn't wander into Gensler's world, so maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but curious your take on how folks should be thinking about this.
It is definitely a conversation that I'm having with a number of different clients, because we know that the youngest generation, being visible, getting promoted, getting that feedback on how well they did, what could they be doing better, is so important. And when we're all working from home and it's just Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, you don't get that kind of feedback that you do when you're in the office. And that conversation, I think back when I was young and I was growing, and I still want that kind of feedback even today, that after a major presentation, you're walking back to your desk and you're debriefing, hey, this worked well, we could have done this a little bit better. And that kind of feedback as part of your career development is so important. But it's also the formal feedback, it's throughout it's the informal in the moment. But it's also just creating spaces that people can sit and get that kind of feedback all the way through the year. And what we're starting to learn is that's where some of the third places, coffee bar areas, Daniel, you were saying, just sit in kind of the cafe and be accessible for that kind of feedback. And those types of spaces, whether they're in the office or in the neighborhood, become really important as part of that overall work experience that we're trying to promote. So we're hearing it from leaders. How do we create these spaces and these opportunities? And we're hearing it from the young generation of really wanting that kind of coaching and mentoring.
We're going to wrap in just a few minutes. So if you have any additional questions, please toss them in the Q&A. But I always am curious, if you could snap your fingers, Daniel, and have the space of, what you believe to be the inevitable future of really high quality space design and office use. What does that look like? You show up on next Monday and it's all changed. What does that look like, and how is it different from today?
Well, there's a particular type of space that I love more than any other space. And, we've seen this shift to like really small meeting spaces over the last, 6 years or something like that. and everyone's gone really in on the like the huddle in the phone room and these furniture solutions for phone rooms. So we've built this project room, which is really a lot of dynamic movable things, sofas, high bench seating, movable whiteboards, video conferencing with cameras from multiple angles. And it's all meant to support project teams doing things like, really like in my mind, when we try to do this, it's more of like, what would you see it at Pixar or Disney in an ideation room? I think that type of space,
Liam
which is
Neeson, cutouts of Liam Neeson, I think, is
yeah,
probably
yeah. But it's a very tactile room for me, and it has a lot of purpose. Oh, it's able to support a lot of different purposes and ways of working. So I think that we're building fewer of those spaces, but we're building them in more of our locations. So probably for me, it would be quite a number of that type of space in one area. And I like, for me, the perfect office would be like this high energy side of the building, which is just like project rooms and cafes and coffee bars and music. And then on the other side, it'd be like a library with like some jazz or something, something not distracting, where and I don't think of it as like enclosed space. I just think of it as like the norm there is to just be more quiet.
Janet?
I would agree. I mentioned before this spectrum of deep focus and hyper collaboration. I would love to see the reverse of what we have today. Instead of open plan for focus, that it's more open for this collaboration, and that you can start to create these team spaces, and you can use that for a duration, not just for an hour, but maybe it's more like a war room or project room that you could use it for a number of weeks. And then you can go to this library area that is more private. And I would love to see the return of more private offices to be able to do that deep focus, to be able to signal to others, I don't want to be interrupted. And I just want to get this thought down on paper before I resurface and am available again. So I think it's both ends of the spectrum.
Daniel, you demuted. What were you gonna add something?
I was going to ask Janet. One of the things for me, the decisions that I make when I go to the office is that I'm not going to get any, focus work done. Not that I'm not going to get any work done, but like my agenda is, if I'm going to sit and write a review or whatever, like that's not going to happen. So what sort of choices would you make when you're going into the office? Do you think you would go into the office and have like an hour where I got to do this and I'm going to go back out into the world and expose myself to distractions? Or would you just stay at home if you had to like get your heads down work done?
Although if you're going in for a whole day, let's say you're going in for that work session with your whole team, there's a break and suddenly you need to make a revision to this or answer something to your CEO or whatever it might be. And suddenly, because work is dynamic and things pop up that you don't anticipate. So I still think that during those breaks, you need that private space in order to get the heads down and just get this done. Or you're working apart and then you're pulling it back together. And it's like, let's take a break. Let's all write these sections. Let's analyze this. Let's come back together and see how it feels again once we start putting it together. I still think that even though you're coming in to do that collaboration, that's socializing with others, it's not a full day of that. There's still these staccatos of deep focus that you need to get done. But you're right. If I have to write a big report, let's say the next research paper or putting together a presentation, I'm going to do that where I don't have distractions. I'm probably not going to go into the office to do that type of work.
And I'm going to miss, just personally, the demuting as like an indication that someone wants to jump in. Like I wish like everybody had sort of a little red green sort of dot that they wore at all times. I heard this lovely concept that the office is primarily for building trust. meaning that creating space so that teams can get together so that they don't feel like you just have these like 1 hour blocks that you interact with, kind of a 2D version of Andrew or a 2D version of Daniel or Janet. I'm curious if there are active things that you are doing to ensure that you build trust with folks, particularly new people that you've hired. Daniel, you said that you continue to hire throughout the pandemic. How do you ensure that they feel deeply connected such that they can, contribute, other than just giving them a space to congregate?
I mean, that's a big one. I mean, we've had people that have joined who only know the people that have been in their scheduled meetings, and that might be like 10 people. And I think some of the analytics around network strength are going to be pretty important for us. I think it was important in the office that you didn't like join and get sat at a desk and then, we'll come back to you and like you never get introduced to someone. Like they're like entire HR efforts, talent management efforts been put around like, you've joined the company. Now let's introduce you to 1,000 people. Let's make big posts. Like, here's a photo with the CEO. Like, we want you to know that you're welcome here. And I think something similar, like programs will start to come up where, let's say that you've hired someone out in a place where we don't even have an office that they can go visit. How do you introduce them to a wide variety of people? How do you build that network? And probably, I started in Sydney and they eventually flew me to California. I met a bunch of people. So I think travel will probably play a part in that. But I think I can't think of any magic tools for this. It's just, being really intentional.
Yeah, I think it's intentional behaviors. It's reaching out. It's making yourself accessible, and it's that virtual coffee, virtual wine that you're able to connect with somebody and get to really know them. I think that's been one of the wonderful things about this hybrid world that we've been working from home is you get a chance to see somebody like their surprise visit from a little kid. You get to see their homes. We've seen a side of people, whether they're clients or whether they're colleagues, that you didn't get to see necessarily pre-pandemic. And I would hate to lose that part. It feels like we're bringing our whole self to the table, which has been an unexpected benefit.
That's so interesting. It's almost like in the digitization of all of our relationships, we have somehow found new ways to connect.
Exactly.
Yeah, Daniel, you demuted. To you. Over to you.
Well, at the start of the pandemic, everyone was doing these like happy hours and things where I found it kind of awkward because if you didn't have something to say or you didn't know how to cut through, because I mean, for us, it was like probably, it's like, okay, everyone in workplace, here's a happy hour you can join. And like 40 people would join the first time. It's like, who's going to talk though? Everyone's got their drink. And maybe one person is trying to awkwardly like start a conversation, but 40 people can't talk at the same time in a medium like this. So what I don't know if it's like really that corporate, but I started hosting poker nights. And what I find is anyone can join, and it's the only problem I find with it is it's not super inclusive because you kind of have to know how to play poker, but it could be Uno. Like I don't think it matters. I think it just needs to be something that you can do. You're part of it because like through your actions, not so much through conversation. And what I like the most about it is it gives you something to talk about that's there. Oh, look at that hand or whatever. Like, I can't believe you won that. Gives people chances to interact. And when I look at Twitch, I think of Twitch as like these communities that are being built around watching one person do something and they're talking to each other and they're getting to know each other. I would probably think about something like that where as we think about like how do we create these virtual communities, it's probably something like that. Watching Janet kind of like do something awkward for the first time and like everyone gets to laugh about it. And like, you know, instead of having like the common enemy, it's like the common good sort of that brings people together. Like, oh, I can't wait till next month when Janet tries to, I don't know, sculpt
Balance
some
a
clay or
watermelon.
something.
Right.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
yeah.
We should do this. We should do this in a month, and we'll schedule this for all of the webinar attendees. That Janet's going to balance a watermelon on her head or something. No, I think
Practicing now.
yeah, there was something that was surprisingly satisfying that we saw show up with the density folks, where someone would live stream them designing an interface. One of our designers would do this, and people would jump in, and they would just, music would be playing, and they would just be designing, and they would talk about the designs, and they talk about life, and they talk about their dog, and I think you're very much onto something. That, like, what is it about the concept of Twitch that is so compelling for so many viewers simultaneously? What is the background music that allows people to just kind of be with one another? Forced fun is like really not as much fun. Poker and like arguing over like whether or not random number generators are having an impact on the river, is way more interesting. I wanted to maybe close with a note about privacy. Janet, you opened with privacy. And I didn't ask a follow-up question. What did you mean by privacy is really important, and what were you referring to?
Well, if you think about how we've been working for the last year and a half, like I'm sitting in a room, here at home, and I have been very private from the standpoint of I can shut the door, I can have this conversation. I'm not having to sit 6 feet from another person. As I start thinking about going back to the office and continuing this, virtual, with whoever I'm working with across our firm or with clients that may not be sitting in the office, it's going to require a change of behavior. I'm going to need to find a conference room, a huddle room, something in order to continue to really work in the same way. And so I think we've gotten very used to having privacy working from home that is going to, that we're going to need to provide back in the office once we get there.
Makes sense. You both do really interesting work. If folks wanted to learn more about what's going on at LinkedIn, things that you're learning, stuff that Gensler is sort of putting out around studies or stuff that they're learning across different clients, is there a place that people can go to learn a bit more?
There certainly is at Gensler. If you just go to our website under research, we have shared all of our research right there. And we've even got studies by country.
Cool.
And we do see Australia being a little different than the US, Daniel.
Daniel, anything on the LinkedIn side, or is it mostly mediums like this?
Yeah, we don't have like a website for this yet. I think we probably will. I would recommend following Brett Howtop and some of his team. We do post occasionally about the future work and things that we're struggling with. Like particularly, I think what's interesting is what are we struggling with? Mm-hmm. Not just what do we think is the future. So that's probably the best medium for now.
Cool. I love the concept of
what you can get both of us on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah, I hear there's a professional social network that you can use to connect with folks.
Yeah.
All right, to everybody who stuck around sort of for overtime, really appreciate it. I realized I didn't introduce myself. My name is Andrew Farah. I'm co-founder of and CEO of Density. We sometimes talk to really fascinating folks about the work that they do in workplace design and space. Daniel, Janet, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. And thanks everybody for attending. We'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Andrew.